map size, the total.
Some of the all of which can shape.
Here we see some skill checks.
This is from
Quick outer game, including anticipating the total map size, the total. They will find very
When starting, the user will also be able to switch in field using links.
You can see final count.
small bit of respect from the students. As he, Dookie, and Randy walk out of school, Prez asks Randy what he wants to do when he grows up, and Randy responds that he wants to own a store. Prez tells him that's smart and he's going to need a lot of math to do that. Though it seems insignificant, this is a smart way for Prez to build a connection of what he's teaching in class to something Randy is interested in. Ultimately, it's small things like this that helps Prez build relationships with his students. When Prez spots Kareem and Michael playing cards together, he has another breakthrough when he realizes that the kids do want to learn, and they do want to learn from him. He's just been approaching it the wrong way. The kids really begin to enjoy the lessons, and this helps him connect and build trust with them. Think about how excited the kids got when Prez taught them dice and odds. In fact, it became their favorite activity. As he says, trick them into thinking they aren't learning, and they do. This is what engagement is. Meeting people on their level so you both get what you want out of the interaction. It also builds trust. It shows people you care. When taking height measurements, Prez tells Michael he heard he likes to box, so based on his height and wingspan, he must have a good reach. It's small things like this that build that trust. This is why Randy, Dookie, and even Michael are willing to speak with him regarding little Kevin when they wouldn't go to anyone else. After the fight in which Randy gets jumped, he asks Prez if things will get better. In a sense, Prez is now almost a father figure to his students, which is why he goes so far to fight for them and why they trust him more than others. For anyone that's worked with others, whether in a caregiver setting, service industry, or just having to be responsible for another person over time, compassion fatigue and burnout are real things. Compassion fatigue is when a person is so involved in the work that they almost become numb to it. They lose the ability to empathize with others. On the other hand, burnout is the opposite. The person becomes so overwhelmed and fear they aren't doing enough, despite everything that they've already done. For Prez, the danger is burnout. It's a lesson he learns harshly in Season 5 when he meets up with Dookie. Though it is a short interaction, Prez learns one final important lesson, that no matter what you do for someone, you have to let them go to find their own way. It's a solemn reminder of what another teacher advised him earlier in the show, that there are always going to be more students that need his help, and he needs to be able to be ready to help them just as much. It's important to remember it's not always about you. You have to remind yourself that you're just one person, and that it's not your responsibility to save everyone from themselves or their circumstances. That is not a burden that you are capable of being responsible for. This is why it's vitally important to have something outside of your job. Remember when Lester asks McNulty what he expects is going to happen when the case is over. Was he expecting a parade or a golden statue? Separating yourself is detrimental if you want to continue to have a strong impact on others, or you will suffer from burnout or compassion fatigue. So what can we learn from Prez, and what can we as leaders do if we work with someone like Prez? First is engagement. Prez was a completely different person when he was being engaged on his interest level. Now, it's not always your job as a leader to make sure your team finds the work worthwhile or that they're being fulfilled. After all, they accepted the job and are still being held to a certain level of expectations. However, if you think you can or need to get more out of them, think about why they're not engaged. For Prez, he just wasn't in the right position with the right people to guide him. Think about your team. Are there people that might be better suited in other positions? Do you have people that love details that you have in an oversight position? If you have someone that comes into work every day that seems disengaged, find out why. This is also a good time to find out why they're there and if they should stay there. Maybe they do want to be there, and maybe they don't. If they don't, you take the opportunity to let them go somewhere else, as Daniels did Detective Polk. A lot of supervisors are so caught up in the day-to-day of what needs to be done and putting out fires that they forget they are working with people. Human beings are social creatures. Even if they're introverted and quiet, they still want to be connected with. As a teacher, when Prez engages students in a relatable way, he is able to connect with them because he knows them more than just a student. How much time are you spending getting to know your staff? Do you know what motivates them, what they like and they don't like? And is it because you're genuinely interested in them, or is it a means to an end? Authentic connections are going to get you results in the long run. I never understood managers who frown on employees spending time engaging in regular conversation. A conversation about someone's favorite restaurant can be just as productive as a conversation about last week's expense report, but which do you think is going to pay off a larger dividend in the long run? Second, let people face consequences. Protecting someone from consequences, especially someone who is used to getting away with things, is the worst thing you can do for that person. It's also disrespectful because you're in fact telling them that you think so lowly of them that you don't think they're capable of learning from their mistakes. Sometimes being forced to face what we did is actually just what we need to move forward. For Prez, it gives him the boost to realize he needs to make a change. When we put people in situations where they're never accountable for their actions, they will inevitably wind up in over their head because their position and status level has been inflated beyond what they're capable of, like when Prez was put in charge of Valchek's investigation. Also, when Prez learns to deal with the consequences of his actions, he sees the importance of letting others face the consequences of their actions. This allows him to speak to his students like adults, and they in turn seem to respect him for it. People respect those who they know are also accountable. Number 3, set boundaries and expectations. Prez never had any real expectations set for him, partially because no one held him to a high enough standard, and second because no one really believed he was capable of achieving anything in the first place. Many times when you have a low-level performer, it's not surprising you'll find that the person had no expectations or very low expectations to begin with. Throughout the show, we see that guys like Prez were allowed to get by over and over again for a variety of reasons because of low expectations. Think about it this way. Have you ever given a task to a teenager and told them what needs to be done, how it should be done, and they'll come back later having done a good job? Chances are, you have. Sometimes they'll even do a better job than you thought they would. Remember, young adults want validation from those in authority, despite their attitude that sometimes says otherwise. Just like young adults want expectations set for them, people in the workplace are similar. They want to know what the standard is, how they can meet it, and they also want validation that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and that they're doing a good job. In a lot of ways, supervising a team is like coaching young adults. It's hard to avoid the mindset of, well, they're adults, so they need to get things done regardless of how they feel when we deal with disengaged employees. After all, as adults, they should be responsible enough to know that even if they don't like the job or aren't interested, they still need to handle their responsibilities. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case. You may need to approach these people similar to the way you would a young adult. Again, it's not a bad thing, it just means you might need to change the way you set expectations. The final lesson is this: learn to separate yourself from the work. One of the teachers tells Prez to have kids of his own so he doesn't become too wrapped up in the stress of the school system. Work-life balance is incredibly important, and unfortunately, it's something that most people just push aside. Let's say you work for a company and have the highest sales record every year for several years. You are the top of the top and dedicate hours of your life to the company. You work 60 plus hours a week, you've missed important family moments, but you're super successful. The day you walk out of the door on your last day, your name will be taken down off your door and you'll be replaced in a week, if not sooner. Maybe you're the director at a nonprofit organization and you've helped thousands of people. You've dedicated your life to the cause. You've worked long, grueling hours because you know you're making a difference. You think to yourself, if I don't do this work, people will suffer and there's no one else to help them. But over time, you get burned out. You get sick. You don't do your job as well. You become depressed. You eventually have to step away because you can't deal with it anymore. If you think these two scenarios are fiction, think again. This is all real. It's so important to have something outside of your work that allows you to escape and recharge. You need to take care of your mental health first and foremost. As a leader, make sure your team is taking care of their mental health too. If you want the best out of your team, you need to give them the best. We see what happens to people in the show that can't separate themselves from the work, like Jimmy McNulty. Roland Przybylewski is a good example of what could have been to what came to be. His story arc plays out like a coming-of-age story, like a young man looking to find his way in a world of shortcomings. By learning from our mistakes and helping those around us overcome their obstacles, we can make sure we're properly identified as leaders. A prominent theme that plays out in many TV shows, particularly The Wire, Game of Thrones, or The Sopranos, is a process in which people seek, gain, and wield power. Human beings, especially men, tend to organize themselves in a hierarchical manner, consciously or subconsciously. No matter where you go, there's a pecking order, and it's usually determined by social dominance. Throughout The Wire, we see dominance hierarchies play out in the consequences of what happens when men are in positions they did not earn, don't have the ability to handle, and do not have the respect of those they're expected to lead. Whether it's in the drug game, the political sphere, or the education system, the juking of stats so that majors become colonels and mayors become governors has disastrous consequences for any organization as a whole. Dominance hierarchies play a crucial role in determining why some leaders are well respected and others are not. As with any sort of personality analysis, where someone falls in a hierarchy isn't necessarily good or bad or make them good or bad as a person. It's just a way of looking at a behavioral pattern to determine why some people may be successful in certain situations, whereas another person may not. When we look at shows like The Wire or The Sopranos, we can look at how characters in these shows operate within their own hierarchy and analyze why some characters seem to be better suited to lead than others, even though they may have similar technical skills and experience. We can then take that information and compare it to an office-type environment or other places that rely on hierarchies to operate effectively. I will be focusing specifically on male dominance hierarchies, as female dominance hierarchies operate differently. When I refer to a dominance hierarchy, I'm referring to where a man falls in the pecking order alongside other men, regardless of any sort of artificial status, meaning that just because a person is in a position of power, it doesn't necessarily qualify them as an alpha. It is important to understand how this dynamic works because it gives a better understanding of why some people react the way they do, predict how they will react, and what happens when they're put in a position they may not have the social dominance to be successful in. There are two prominent male dominance hierarchies. The first is a simple alpha-beta model, which suggests that there are alphas who are successful with dating and sexual relationships with women, and betas who are unsuccessful. The other model is a bit more in-depth and considers more than just the success or failure of one's sexual pursuits. This model includes the alpha, bravo, delta, gamma, and omega. So let's start with the alpha male. When people think of an alpha male, they often think of the powerful CEO or the stereotypical captain of the football team who's dating the hottest cheerleader. Often loud, some alphas like to peacock or show off their machismo, such as Floyd Mayweather, while others are calculating and ruthless, such as Michael Jordan. Whatever the case may be, an alpha is driven by their own self-gratification and their overall status within a group. Oftentimes, alpha behavior is bewildering to people around them, especially lower status men, as they see women swoon over what would normally be considered ridiculous behavior. It's not uncommon to hear a lower status guy whisper to his friend while watching an alpha show off for a girl who appears to be loving it, "Girls actually fall for that stuff, but when they try the same thing, they fail miserably." And I may or may not be speaking from experience. Alphas tend to be successful as leaders because people want to follow them. They have a charisma that can inspire, but also an aloofness because they don't panic or get flustered easily when things go bad. They can also be extremely intense and driven to succeed, and since their primary goal is to basically just win at all costs, they tend to never back down. As with any group, there isn't just one type of alpha, but those are just some general characteristics. The key thing to remember about an alpha, though, is that people openly want to follow them. As a leader, alphas can fail, though, because they're typically more interested in their own image than with the group's overall well-being. This can cause them to surround themselves with people that aren't competent or capable. They also seek out conflict and often create issues of conflict when a more tactful solution would be better. Alphas sometimes only surround themselves with sycophants and will cut off anyone who isn't wishing to stroke their ego. Finally, alphas often have an X factor, that trait you just can't define. They just have it, and that it is what makes people want to follow them. It's what drives people crazy trying to understand why some people are successful and others aren't. Some great examples of alpha males in fictional entertainment are Tony Soprano and Avon Barksdale. In the real world, we have Michael Jordan and Floyd Mayweather. Next is the Bravo. The Bravo is a socially dominant man, however not as much as the Alpha. They tend to be doers and are great at developing a vision within a broader vision. In short, they're great operations people, such as a VP of a company. While Bravos can be great leaders, they tend to do better leading small teams rather than an entire organization. Bravos have great interpersonal skills and can often act as a mediator between an alpha and others. As leaders, Bravos are successful when they're able to build their own vision that is part of a much larger vision. Bravos want to help their teams and their alpha become successful before their own personal success. A great quote that sums up a Bravo is from Silvio Dante from The Sopranos. Some people are better at being number twos. As he later states, he prefers the behind the scenes, the advice, and the strategy, and that's where the Bravo is excellent at. The mistake occurs when a Bravo thinks that because they are successful within their smaller capacity, that they can then step into the alpha shoes and be just as successful. Unfortunately, that's not typically the case. Oftentimes, a Bravo may have achieved great results in their own position, so then they are promoted to the top tier position where they are the ones required to lay out the overall vision, and this is where they fail. In situations like this, they are often lost or flustered and unsure of themselves. Because they typically play the mediator role, they aren't used to asserting their dominance required for the top tier position. Great examples of Bravos are Silvio Dante in The Sopranos, Tyrion Lannister in Game of Thrones, and Meyer Lansky in Boardwalk Empire. Deltas are your everyman, your nice guy, and this is what most guys are. The backbone and workhorse of any organization, these are arguably the most important piece of the puzzle. For some Deltas, they're the guys that just want to do their job well, get paid, and go home. Other Deltas desperately want to be more successful in their careers or with women, and they overreach. In the rare instance that they land a higher status role or an extremely attractive woman, they spend most of their time worrying about losing what they have, which they often do. Deltas tend to romanticize relationships and often find themselves at odds with higher status men wondering, what does he have that I don't? Deltas aren't typically upfront, and if they are, they spend the night before rehearsing in their head every scenario of what might happen. Typically, Deltas should be allowed to do their job as they have a strong work ethic and are generally reliable. They don't seek conflict and don't do well with it when they find it. In leadership roles, Deltas often struggle because they don't have the social dominance to eliminate conflict because they can't assert their own authority. The only way they can assert dominance is by threatening to bring in someone in a higher position to enforce the rules. Often, if they are in a position of power, they don't carry the respect of others on the team and will often be undermined by them. Think of Gigi Chestone from The Sopranos. Deltas in the entertainment role will be Jorah Mormont from Game of Thrones, Agron from Spartacus, and Jake Hoyt, Ethan Hawke's character in Training Day, who is also a classic Delta. Moving to the lower tier now, we have reached the Gamma. Gammas are interesting because I like to refer to them as wannabe alphas. These are the guys who quietly and bitterly despise everyone around them for not seeing them for how great they are. Gammas are the ones who make it a point to hold grudges against anyone who even looked at them in a way they didn't like. Their mood tends to change based on if they got their way or not, and it can change on a dime. They're the guys who take any sort of critical feedback as a personal attack. They're the ones who get upset if they send you a message and you don't reply immediately, as they believe you aren't being respectful of them. Gammas in charge of anything are a great way to destroy any company, organization, or group. Ironically, Gammas are sometimes openly invited to participate in group activities because they are able to come off as positive and likable, which is why I referred to them as wannabe alphas. Gammas like to think they're well-liked and fun to be around. They think being in charge is the same as leading. However, things start to fall apart once people in the group realize that they invited a nightmare into their circle. They might be the guy who thinks every girl should see them for quote-unquote who they really are, and they're the ones who are always interjecting themselves into conversations and trying to impress everyone with their facts and figures no one asked for. Gammas in general are socially inept and completely self-unaware. They do not understand social boundaries and often repulse the people around them, particularly women, as they are the men who can't take no for an answer. They typically lash out if they get turned down or become vindictive if they don't get their way. If you have Gammas in your organization, your best bet is to isolate them and relegate them to small independent projects. If you are able, you should try to get rid of them as soon as possible. They are toxic to anything productive. Alphas can't stand them because they're always trying to start trouble. Bravos dislike them because they don't follow directions well and are always wanting to do everything their way, and Deltas hate them because they make everyone else uncomfortable while they're just trying to do their job. Your female employees will be creeped out by them and will not want to work with them. The key factor in determining if someone is a Gamma is Gammas always lie and they always project, but most importantly, they're bitter. They're bitter about everything. They're bitter that there are people that are more successful than them, more intelligent than them, and more respected than them. When Gammas are put in charge of anything, they quickly abuse any sort of power they have. They often use it to retaliate against people they felt might have slighted them in the past. A great example of a Gamma from entertainment is Joffrey Baratheon from Game of Thrones or Stan Velchek from The Wire. Finally, there's the Omega, the lowest of the low, the total social reject. Not much is known about them because no one thinks to invite them anywhere, and that's really all I can say about it. But as you consider the hierarchy, remember, it doesn't matter what you think you are or what you want to be, all that matters is how people accept you. Very few people stay at one level in every situation. In fact, your status can change based on who you're around and what you're doing. For example, Stringer Bell in The Wire was alpha in some circumstances, but he also had many Bravo traits which showed why he wasn't successful when he set off on his own. He also had many Gamma tendencies with his constant obsession to get back at people that he felt wronged him, regardless of the impact it would have on anyone else. Consider this, you could be a total alpha male in small-town America. Maybe you dominated in sports, dated the hottest girls in your school of 400 kids, but then you go to a big college and now you're just another fish in a big pond. Your personality, attitude, and social dynamic are going to change based on those factors. There is a lot of gray area in the hierarchy, and again, this isn't necessarily set in stone. All this does is give some insight into why some people tend to be successful and why others aren't. Remember, being an alpha isn't necessarily a good thing, and being a delta isn't necessarily bad. It just depends on the self-awareness of the individual and how they mitigate their shortcomings. There's also the concept of submission that needs to be addressed. Submission to a more dominant person isn't weakness, nor is it a sign that you are inferior. It simply means deferring to them having the final say on a decision. That's it. It doesn't mean the person who submits is not important, nor does it mean the person with the final say is superior. In short, the submitting person gives way to someone who is better equipped to make a decision based on the current situation. A perfect example of this would be in the documentary The Last Dance that showed an inside look at the Bulls' final championship season in the 90s. In the documentary, it is very obvious that Dennis Rodman is very much an alpha male. However, when it came to the basketball court, he knew it was best for him to follow Jordan's lead. That didn't make him weaker or less. It just showed he knew the hierarchy and how to place himself within it to best serve the team. This is what makes leadership so difficult. It goes way beyond someone wanting to be in charge. Being a leader is accepting total responsibility and being accountable to those who have submitted to your leadership. It isn't to be taken lightly, so it's important to keep this in mind when you hear people saying they want to be in charge or they want to lead. Do they really want to lead, or do they just want the accolades that come with being in a powerful position? As a leader, you need to do everything you can to avoid putting people in a position that will disrupt the effectiveness of the organization. I've been in departments and organizations where a single person was in a position they had no business being in, and it completely destroyed the morale of the entire place. Now, not every situation is that extreme, but your organization's greatest currency and asset is the people in it, so you need to invest in putting them in a position to win. Remember, this dominance hierarchy isn't based on titles or authority. It's based on social interaction. You can use that to your advantage when building teams. Look for people that work well together. If it's an intense project with strict deadlines, you may want to consider putting an alpha in a position who will set a vision and get things done. If it's a long-term project that requires a lot of patience, technical work, and individual contributions rather than group work, you may want to keep that in the hands of your deltas, as putting an alpha in charge may drive them nuts and it may not be good with the technical skills you need. These are just things to consider as you develop people around you. As a leader, you need to be the one to put people in the best position possible. Understanding the dominance hierarchy will give us an insight into different characters and why they act the way they do. By recognizing behaviors in certain individuals, we can also predict how others will respond to them. Consider different characters and think about where they would fall into the hierarchy and if their traits match up to where you think they are. Do characters respond to them the way you predict they would? As I continue to make videos on characters, keep the hierarchy in mind, as I will be using it to analyze their actions. Finally, think of your own social circles, and does the hierarchy help explain some of the social dynamics? One of the most important parts of leadership is understanding people, and this is just another tool you can use to help others develop. People are generally driven to achieve a certain status level or standard of living that they, in essence, believe will bring them respect and the life they dream of having. For some people, it's power. For others, it's the need for validation and respect. Still, others are driven by freedom or survival. Proposition Joe, however, is a rare example of a person whose ambitions aren't really clear. We know it's not to become king of the game because he stays in the background and seems to prefer keeping a lower profile, and he doesn't seem to want to go legit either. So, what is Prop Joe's endgame? Prop Joe uses his wit and intellect to make deals with his rivals and allies to keep his position secure and his supply protected, but beyond that, he doesn't seem to really make a play in one particular direction. Joe also seems to find some sort of pleasure in playing the middle against both ends. There are several times when he manipulates situations when he doesn't really need to, or when a more straightforward approach would be better or simpler. But to really look at Prop Joe, we need to start at the beginning. In a flashback scene from Joe's days as a school kid, he is seen attempting to sell another kid the results to a test. The other kid threatens to beat Joe and take the results without paying. Without blinking an eye, Joe nonchalantly rebuffs his threats and tells him he should reconsider, as he'll need Joe for future tests in the near future. When the kid pays less than what he owes, Joe then goes to his teacher and actually gets her to pay for information on who will be cheating on the test, thus getting back at the other kid and making up the money he lost. This is an important scene because Joe is shown throughout the show as a man who sort of has all the answers. People seem to believe whatever he says without question, and he always seems to find a way to come out on top. What makes that so interesting is Joe isn't the kind of person that really commands respect just on his personality. He's soft-spoken, he isn't a violent or intimidating person, and he comes off as sort of a big brother figure. People like Joe because he's a likable guy. But the truth is, Joe is never the person who he portrayed himself to be. The kid who threatened to beat up Joe tells him, "You're a snake, Joe," but Joe responds, "I don't have a reputation for doing business that way." However, the kid immediately questions the validity of the test and almost immediately calls Joe a snake, meaning that Joe in fact does have a reputation for being devious. Shortly after, when Joe pulls his teacher to the side to tell her about the cheating kid, before he even says anything, she rolls her eyes and says, "What is it this time?" So again, he has a reputation of being a hustler who always finds himself in the middle of things. Fast forward to the events of the show, and Joe is the same person he was in 1962. He's always in the middle of everything, and he's always trying to manipulate the scenario toward his favor. Up until the show starts, it seems like he's done a pretty good job of it too. As the show continues, Joe's schemes get bigger and have more consequences. Joe is able to manipulate others into doing things for him as well, such as when he was able to work with Stringer to pit Brother Muzone against Omar in Season 2, and in Season 4 he gets Omar to stick up a card game that Marlo is playing in, hoping this will get Marlo to finally join the co-op. Though the plan is a success, it also has consequences as it gives Marlo an inroad to the Greeks, which he eventually uses in order to thwart the co-op. This causes Joe to finally meet his demise after realizing he dug himself too deep of a hole by getting in the middle of things with Marlo. I found Prop Joe interesting because he's a character that has a lot of influence, but due to his inability to stay in his own lane, he's unable to really gain anything. He's the kind of person that just can't leave well enough alone. When the co-op faced a problem with Marlo taking up too much territory and the New York dealers also infringing on their territory, instead of actually devising a plan to deal with the problems in a way that would minimize risk, Joe invites the one person that everyone knows is ruthless with open arms. During the co-op meeting, when one dealer says he'd like to see Marlo in the co-op, Joe stays silent. He neither questions or even brings up any reservations, despite the fact everyone else just got done talking about how dangerous Marlo is. Later on, Slim accurately predicts that Marlo was going to betray him, but Joe dismisses it, which actually tells us a lot about him. So let's look at Joe's strengths. Joe is good not only at reading people, but knowing what they wanted, which he always used to his advantage. It was how he was able to talk himself out of so many situations and turn a negative situation into a positive one nearly every time it happened. Joe understood what was valuable to people, and he always had something they wanted or access to. When I got my first job in high school, my mom told me to make myself indispensable to my boss, so no matter what happened, they couldn't get rid of me. Joe did the same thing. People thought they needed him even if they really didn't. Not only did Joe sell people access to things they wanted, but he did it in such a way that they thought they could only get it from him. Joe knew that most of the people he dealt with weren't going to investigate what he told them or see if they could get what they wanted elsewhere, which is another advantage that he had. Joe also had a way with people. He's well liked. You can tell by the way others spoke about him that he was well respected. He may not always have been the most ethical, but it seems that most people just chalked that up as the price of doing business with him, and since they were getting what they wanted too, there was really no reason to make a big deal out of it. But now, when we look at Joe's flaws, we begin to understand why things fell apart for him. His biggest flaw was his complacency. While Joe was smart and good at reading people, he thought he was smarter than everyone else. He's been playing the same game since at least 1962, and he got really good at playing it too. His strategy of being able to assist people in getting what they wanted at a price he wanted had worked for 4 decades, so Joe had no reason to believe he couldn't continue to use the same strategy. He never even considered Omar and Marlowe were exceptions to the rule, but they were just 2 people that he could manipulate just like everyone else. A man with Joe's tenure in the game should have at least been highly skeptical of Marlowe, but instead, Joe just tries to recruit him thinking he's going to be easy to control, despite warnings from others and evidence to the contrary. Marlowe knew how to take advantage of Joe always having his guard down around him. Joe introduces Marlowe to his lawyer, shows him how to run the scam, and feeds him with information that an internet search could have found, but in some ways, he was handing the keys right over to Marlowe while expecting him not to take them. When Marlowe finally corners Joe before he can leave town, Joe begs for his life, saying he'll go away and live quietly and not come back. Marlowe calls his bluff because he knew that Joe is the type of person that can't leave things well enough alone and needs to have his hands on everything. Marlowe beat Joe at his own game and Joe paid the price. On the other hand, Omar also knew how to smell through all of Joe's BS. Joe tells Omar if he ever steals from him, he'll kill his whole family. It's clear that Omar doesn't believe it, as he doesn't even react when he's told that, and later not only does he steal from Joe, but he sells a stolen product back to him. Also, when Omar tells Joe his time ran out, not only was he referring to Joe's little scheme he was currently up to, but in a sense he was telling Joe, your time's up, I figured you out, and your streak is over. He also warns Joe to avoid doing anything devious, as he knew what Joe was going to try to do before he did it. Based on Joe's reaction, we can see that he's never been challenged like this before. Another flaw is Joe never really asserts himself as a dominant person or a leader that commands respect. Despite owning the drug connect, he still acts like a participant in the New Day co-op rather than the man in charge who calls all the shots. Stringer acts as a chair, and Joe is more of a moderator than anything. This makes him come from a position of weakness, which may have been assigned to Marlowe that Joe wasn't capable of holding on to it. As someone who is always looking to take advantage of every opportunity, it's interesting that Joe doesn't use the drug connect more to his own advantage, considering how valuable it is. He doesn't really protect it, and he doesn't really seem to be concerned about what could happen if he loses it. In fact, he basically tells Slim Charles that the Greek will trust him over Marlowe just because he's been working with him longer. Again, this is a passive role rather than an active dominant role, and it caused him to miscalculate Marlowe's actions. In the end, Joe is his own worst enemy. He's a guy at the blackjack table that hits a winning streak, but can't walk away once he's made enough. He just has to stay in the game, and not only does he stay in the game, but he tries to get others to play their cards the way he wants them to. I worked with a Prop Joe type person once, and I was one of the people that fell for the con. I didn't realize until much later what actually happened. See, people like Prop Joe are great at making themselves seem useful. They come off as reliable and helpful. They're personable. Remember, Joe was a likable guy, and his cons weren't a big show. They were small and subtle. A little truth here, a little truth there, a small manipulation of the facts, followed by some more truth, and he used that formula with multiple people, and all of a sudden no one knows what really happened, but the person gets whatever they wanted and no one knows any better. Unfortunately, you may also run into people like this at work or in your personal life. The important thing to remember is always watch for patterns. Past behavior is the best predictor for future behavior. Pay close attention to things that sort of make your head tilt. If your intuition says something seems wrong, it probably is. Listen for subtle changes in a story or things that get added into a story. If you do find yourself in a situation like that, ask clarifying questions. Never be afraid to ask people to clarify. Don't ever assume you heard wrong. The people around Joe just assumed he was right and had good intentions. Trust your instincts. As a leader, it's your job to sift through the garbage people try to push on you. Ask yourself, what is this person really saying, and what are they really asking me for? Ask yourself, what do I want out of this, and what do they want out of this? Practice going through this level of questioning, and it will eventually become a habit that will help you quickly decipher whether the person is legitimate or a con artist. Great leaders ask great questions both of the people around them and of themselves. In any sort of negotiation in business, it's important to know exactly what you want and what you're willing to compromise on. It's also important to understand the person you're bargaining with, just like Marlowe and Omar knew who Joe really was. When I was still in my early career, I can remember getting really excited when someone would make an offer for a partnership that I thought would be great, but when I go to my boss about the details, she'd have to rein me in and basically tell me to read the fine print. I learned really quick that while I might be getting something I really wanted, I learned I was actually giving up some of my own control and would be responsible for doing most of the work. In other words, it was a one-sided partnership, and that's what people like Joe count on. In conclusion, always read the fine print. Never be afraid to walk away even if the offer sounds amazing, and never be afraid to call someone on their bluff. This is where your skill in asking clarifying questions can help you sort out the full details. Eventually, when you're dealing with a gamble in your professional life, play the long game. Watch for patterns, ask the questions no one else will, and never compromise on what you know you need. Eventually, you'll end up the winner because eventually their time will run out.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh, hello, you stunningly gorgeous people of the internet. Welcome back or welcome to my channel. We're in a new setting. I have new hair. Don't be shocked because we're going to already be talking about very shocking things in this video. Welcome to another adventure in this place. How are you guys doing? I'm just checking in to say hi. I'm checking in to make sure everybody's pulse is still beating because we just finished in our Berserk series the most disturbing part of the whole story. That's what everyone says. Now, I know that there might be something else coming up, okay? But everybody said, you've reached the most disturbing part. And I got to it, and yes, it was very disturbing. It was very troubling to read. But I've read a lot of really disturbing things that kind of feel on par with that, feel comparable to that experience. And so many people in the comments said, what are you reading that makes this feel like a semi-tame experience? And here I am, delivering on my word to give you those book recommendations because some of these, baby, are gnarly as gnarly can be. We're going to start with semi-tame, books that maybe you've heard of, books that feel like they're kind of wading into disaster, and then we're going to end with some of the most disturbing, disastrous things you've ever laid your eyes on in a book. So let's get started. First and foremost, this is a book that I've actually mentioned when talking about the Berserk series. I had read this for my book club this year, and this one felt like something that was adjacent to the story of Berserk, at least kind of steeping into the way that our childhood affects the way that we develop into being an adult, and that is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. Now, this has always been on all of the weird girl lit books. This is a book that always gets on lists of contemporary novels that have very strange appeal to them, and that makes sense. This wasn't the most disturbing thing that I've ever read, though there were moments of this that really made me feel something. It's about a woman who basically believes that she is an alien on this earth, and she starts cohabitating with a relative. Let's just say that much. A relative. And chaos ensues. The ending scene of this, if you've ever seen the movie The Substance, the ending scene of this felt like The Substance. There is mayhem that happens between 3 characters at the end. Spoiler alert. Not really spoiler alert. No, I won't really get into the relationship that the characters have, but there's 3 characters at the end of this book that are in a house, and they end up essentially, doing the worst things possible to one another that you can even imagine. I think more than anything, like I preface this whole introduction with, is that this feels like it's a meditation on how a very disrupted childhood can affect you in fundamental ways that you don't even realize until you are at that point in your life, and it just feels like it's fully ready to burst and you make these very crass and abrasive decisions. This book does that. I don't think that this is the craziest thing I've ever read. There were definitely moments of this that made me think, and if you're not ready for it, you're not ready for it. This was good though, and it makes me wonder how did Murata sit there and write this breezy and shocking. Okay, listen. So we've conquered our first scary book, our first little scary situation, and now let's get into a book that maybe you've heard about if you are in the literary circles. This one kind of took the internet, the literary online communities by storm, and that is of course A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Now,